structure activity relationship of cyclic antihistamines, even as we look at the specific drugs. That is the metabolism. Vinothiazines, their metabolism will include N-demethylation. They do have dimethyl amino groups, so there can be N-demethylation. They can undergo aromatic hydroxylation. They do have this nitrogen at this position. When they have that nitrogen at that position, remember the nitrogen increases the metabolism of that ring, so those rings can undergo oxidative hydroxylation and occasionally sulfoxidation. They do have a sulfur at this position, which can undergo oxidation, and therefore they can undergo sulfoxidation. From tricyclic analogs, metabolites resulting from, and you can have also, but the main metabolites we are saying are N-demethylated metabolites, aromatic, those aromatic hydroxylated metabolites, and of course also sulfoxides. Those are the main metabolic products of the phenothiazines. So we had already looked at the examples. Phenethazine, we said was the first one, was a prototype. So it was the first one and it had minimal activity. So I think we can say the promethazine now is a prototype with the branching, and we have discussed the trimeprazine and said you can increase the length, decreasing activity, but by branching you off and increase the activity. You also do have another example of the phenothiazines. You can see that's a sulfur, that's a nitrogen. It's just those things that we said. Remember, we did say the nitrogen can be part, just as we have said earlier, can be part. We said, remember, we said it can be part of a 5-membered ring. It can be an aliphatic ring. Here you can see in methadilazine, the nitrogen is in ring. Again, you can see that is the first carbon, second carbon, third carbon, first carbon, second, third, fourth. So we got the lower side. First carbon, that is the first carbon, second carbon, third carbon. So it is agreeing with the conditions where we have said the 2 nitrogen can either be separated with the 2 carbon atoms or 3 carbon atoms. We did mention 3 carbon atoms decreases activity, but you can see what the two carbons are part of a pyroridine ring, therefore introducing constraint because of the cyclic nature of the ring, and therefore allowing for these compounds to bind the receptor optimal. Again, of interest, please note that that nitrogen is indeed substituted, so that it is a tertiary nitrogen, because tertiary nitrogens again are responsible for maximum activity. Of course, this nitrogen, we can consider this is much bulkier, but again, remember, as long as those groups belong in a cyclic ring, constraints allow for those groups to still give us the right size for that molecule to fit the receptor. So that's an example of one of the phenothiazines where the terminal nitrogen is part of a pyroridine ring, a heterocyclic ring with retention of activity, and of course the spacer carbons also being part of the pyroridine ring with retention of activity. So we are done with the phenothiazines. So those are the phenothiazines which are part of the H1 blockers. We do have methadilazine. The nice thing about methadilazine is just to show us that you can have a pyroridine ring, and you can see for these drugs, the pyroridine ring seems to be the optimal heterocyclic ring, as we have also seen in the alkyl derivatives. So it is a ring which is found to be responsible for good activity. So those are the phenothiazines. From the phenothiazines, now we go to the piperidines. They are also tricyclics, because I did tell you in the piperidines, it is where here X is attached to a piperidine ring. So the piperidines is where this is attached to a piperidine ring, and there will be structural difference at the Y. So we'll get some examples. Piperidines, structure related to the tricyclic antidepressants. Again, we look at the tricyclic antidepressants, which include drugs like imipramine, a drug like imipramine and so on. And we will look at them all. Perhaps I'm not going to teach whoever will teach you, will still see, you will still discuss the tricyclic antidepressants, very important drugs, but because of their lack of selectivity, again, having a lot of toxicity, and therefore there has been structural modification to give better antidepressants, which are a little bit more selective. And we have examples of the piperidine tetracyclics, include cyproheptadine. We are going to look at and azatidine and ketotifen. So cyproheptadine, it's an antihistamine and anti-serotonin activity. Azatidine is a little bit more modern. It has good activity and it has lesser toxicity than cyproheptadine. You can't see because of the diene, it means there is a double bond. These are dibenzo cycloheptene, not heptene, cycloheptene, whereas the other one is a cycloheptane. The cyproheptadine means it has a double bond. So they are also known as the dibenzapines or cyproheptadine. So we have the dibenzapine, and we have examples of cyproheptadine and also azatidine. We're going to look at their structures. The cyproheptadine, also known as cyproheptadine. So you can call it cyproheptadine or cyproheptadine. This is just going further to show the structure, but it's also known as cyproheptadine. Anti-H1 activity, and it's much greater than diphenhydramine, and is used primarily as an antipruritic, produces pronounced sedation, and has high affinity for cholinergic and serotonin receptors. It also enhances appetite, thus promote weight gain by increasing food consumption. Indeed, there are some people who use cyproheptadine as an appetite. So there are some people who use it for that. But please do note, because of those other side effects it has, using drugs to promote appetite can be very negative, because for them to promote appetite, they must have CNS activity, and they will have quite a number of toxicities, because of when a drug penetrates the CNS, you never know what else it can do. So it can either be, as I've said, either cyproheptadine or cyproheptadine. As we had already said, you can see that is a phenyl ring. That is the other phenyl ring. This was our sulfur in the phenothiazine. So our sulfur has been replaced with a CH double bond. CH, remember we said this group here can be a CH2, a CH double bond CH, and we said this group here can be either a carbon, hydrogen, or a carbon, and if it's a carbon, it's because there is a double bond, and this is why we are calling it a piperidine derivative. This is a piperidine derivative. The piperidine ring is a 6-membered ring with only one nitrogen, and again you can see this. So here it attaches here, there. So it is more of the unsaturated. It has also some structural resemblance with the unsaturated alkyl. There's some structural resemblance with the unsaturated alkyl derivatives, including pyrobutamine and triploridine, because you can see it has that ring joins with that carbon there, and you have bond. So that double bond, we can understand it because it is found in the unsaturated alkylamines. But of course, it's not an alkylamine because of the piperidine derivative. But I'm saying there is structural resemblance between this drug and the unsaturated alkylamines because of that double bond. So you have that joining there, one carbon there. So you can see one at carbon there. It's a carbon, and then you have one carbon, two carbon, three. So you can see again this because of the constraint. They have a slightly longer spacer. They have a slightly longer spacer because even if you look at the alkylamines, we had 1, 2, 3 carbons. These have 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, as we have discussed, when you introduce these carbons and they are part of a heterocyclic ring or part of a cyclic ring, you introduce strain, and therefore that allows for the slightly longer spacer with retention of activity. The nitrogen, of course, also has more bulkier substituents, and the space of the strain that is allowed. So when you look at that compound, we are seeing that compound also obeys the structural structural, with a slight difference of that spacer, which we are able to explain. And of course, the nitrogen also is tertiary. It is protonable, as we discussed. And I think that drug we can be able to say to a certain extent with slight differences, because of the fact that some of the carbon cyclic ring, the nitrogen is part of a cyclic ring. It allows for a slightly longer chain. It allows for slightly bigger substituents on the nitrogen, and still retains the 5 to 6 angstroms which are required for activity. So that's cyproheptadine. That's the synthesis indication. It's an anti-anaphylactic. So it can be used. All this is because it can be used for allergy. It's an antihistamine, anti-allergic effect. Then from there, the second drug, which is a piperidine derivative, is azatidine. If you look at azatidine, I hope you can see the structural differences between azatidine and cyproheptadine, and you can see one is the isosteric replacement. And we have said along the way, isosteric replacement of one of the benzene ring or phenyl rings with a pyridine ring will increase potency of these drugs. Then you can see the other difference is that in cyproheptadine or cyproheptadine, that is a double bond, there's a saturation there. So azatidine is a dibenzo cycloheptane, whereas the other one was a dibenzocycloheptene. So that is a difference. Actually, that's the main difference. And of course, introduction of the pyridine, isosteric pyridine, and introduction of this isosteric pyridine increases activity in this drug. That's the main difference. So azatidine is a more modern H1 antagonist, has been replaced by 2-pyridyl, and the double bond has been saturated, more potent than cyproheptadine as an H1 antagonist. And we can't be able to explain isosteric replacement of a phenyl ring with a pyridine ring, as we have seen along the classes, will increase antihistamine activity. It also has anti-serotonin and high anticholinergic potency and similar side effects, just like cyproheptadine. It is metabolized by cytochrome 3A4 and 2D6 directly to desloratadine. We mentioned desloratadine as a third generation via oxidative process with hydrolysis. So there is a formulation of that drug, and that's why we are giving it. Could be it is a prodrug, but there is a formulation of azatidine, and there is a formulation of desloratadine, and of course, of desloratadine, and of course, desloratadine is more expensive than, of course, the azatidine. So that, but we are saying in the body, it is going to be metabolized through oxidative N dealkylation, and that will give us the other drug, which has better activity. The minute you remove that methyl group, then you decrease the lipid solubility. The drug has lesser ability to penetrate the BBB, and therefore better peripheral activity, and that we see in the third generation. Then you have the ketotifen, and as we have seen again, ketotifen is an isoster. It is isosteric to the other drugs. Again, if you look at that, we are saying here the phenyl ring has been replaced by a thiophene ring. We have said severally the thiophene again is isosteric to the phenyl ring, but of course, in addition, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. In addition, it is a cycloheptanone. It is a cycloheptanone. It is not a cycloheptane. So it's a cycloheptanone, but it's isosteric. Of course, it is isosteric to cyproheptadine. It is isosteric to cycloheptadine. The advantage of this drug is that it's also given for prophylaxis. It is also given for prophylaxis, and that is because it's a mast cell stabilizer. So not only is it an antihistamine, it's also mast cell stabilizers. So when you have an allergic reaction, it stabilizes them and therefore prevents them from undergoing degranulation, and hence preventing the allergic reaction. So it is also given prophylactically. That is before, in case you have somebody who has very high susceptibility to allergic reactions, they can be given before they get the attack or before they are exposed to the allergen, and you can help them in not getting the attack. So that is ketotifen. Again, you can see structural similarity with, as we have said, the cyproheptadine, and whereby you're saying it's a sulfine derivative, but it's also a cycloheptanone rather than a cycloheptine or a cycloheptane. So that is ketotifen. You can also have other cyclics like doxepin, but doxepin, this we will mention it more as an antidepressant. So it has also been found to have H1 antagonistic activity, but as I have said, it is more used as a cyclic antidepressant. Again, you can see the difference here is that now the oxygen in ketotifen, the oxygen was as a ketone or carbonyl group. Now here, it is as a lactone. The oxygen is part of the cyclic ring, again with retention of activity. And of course, of difference to see is 1, 2, 3, is that this has 3 carbon atoms and instead of the 2 carbon atoms, and therefore, and also it doesn't have branching. And because we did mention you require branching, why it also has other activities. Remember, we said when you have branching, you increase antihistamine activity. When you have 3 carbon atoms, you increase dopamine activity, and that is why this drug will be more used used as an antidepressant than an antihistamine. It has long been available and used clinically as an antidepressant, as I have said. So we'll come across it and we'll look at more of its chemistry when we mention it as an antidepressant. And however, H1 antagonist potency has been released in a cream formulation for relief of pruritus. So, but as I have said, we will look at it again as an antidepressant, but it has also been found to have antihistamine activity. That's also another drug. I will not discuss it much. That is also another example of a drug. These are just examples of a drug. You can see these are piperazine derivatives, which I had mentioned before. It's also a piperazine derivatives. Other drugs, the other drugs, you say other drugs that have been found also to have antihistamine activity. So we move on, and we want to move on. I hope if there are no questions, let me not rush too much. If we do not have any other questions, then we can move now to second generation. So we had promised to look at all of them, and we have. And the others, the miscellaneous, are the ones I have looked at the end. And if you can remember all the others, you are good to go. Hey, this thing, where is it coming from now? Nimekataa kwenda. Simo. All right. So any questions? So as I have said, these are the others that we mentioned. They really do not belong to they do not have all the structural features. You can see they have so many nitrogens. This has an imidazole ring, and instead of the 2 phenyl rings. You can also see this one. That ring is completely different. So that's why I'm leaving them out. But we are honestly saying you can also have others, miscellaneous, with also differences in the structure, but also have been found to have antihistamine activity. I want us to move to a second generation. Let us note that as we move from first generation to second generation, all we are saying is that the second generation antihistamines will have lesser CNS activity. So they must be a little bit more polar to avoid them passing, to reduce the ability of these drugs to pass through the BBB. So that's all we are saying. So they will have structural resemblances with the first generation, but they must also have structural differences where they have molecules or groups that increase their water solubility, their polarity, so that you decrease their ability to penetrate the BBB. You retain them peripherally, but they retain the structural features that allow them to bind the H1 receptor without triggering agonist activity, but giving us antagonist activity by binding that receptor properly and not giving us any histamine activity. So we are saying they are more selective for the peripheral H1 receptor involved in allergies. Where we say more selective, they are not penetrating the BBB. They are concentrating in the periphery and going for the H1 receptors. They have lower side effects because they are more selective. They are bulkier and less lipophilic. Bulkier, less lipophilic than the first generation drugs, nor readily. They do not penetrate the BBB readily. So that is the main difference. And we have about 3 approaches we can look at, because we are saying for them to be less lipophilic, we are only saying, in other words, they are more hydrophilic. They are less lipophilic, more hydrophilic. And for us to make them more hydrophilic, we can have 3 approaches. For us to make them not penetrate the BBI, the BBB, we can have 3 approaches. Number 1, we can make them zeta ions, like the way we talked about, the way we said we can have drugs that are more, that are zeta ionic. If it is zeta ionic, it will have more polarity, like cetirizine, more polarity, and therefore lesser ability to penetrate the BBI. We can also add polar groups, small ionizable polar groups. If we add small ionizable polar groups, then the drug that we get also will have lesser ability to penetrate the BBI. We can also make them lipophilic. We can make them more lipophilic. When you make them more lipophilic, you create what we call depotization within the periphery. They are more held within the periphery, within the lipid membranes. They are released very slowly. There is their depotization within the periphery, released very slowly. And because they are released very slowly, they will maintain low concentrations in the plasma, and the low concentrations will be enough to penetrate the lipid membranes within the periphery without them penetrating, getting into the CNS. So we have those 3 approaches: zeta ionic, all making them more ionic, or sometimes making them more lipid soluble, and therefore retaining them within the periphery, within the lipid membranes, which indeed we do call depotization. So there are 3 approaches used to reduce the BBB, or blood-brain barrier absorption. The most obvious is to add polar or highly ionizable groups to decrease the lipid water partition coefficient. Remember, the lipid water partition coefficient is when you take this drug and you place it, or you want to distribute that drug within a lipid layer, and the lipid layer is usually buffered octanol and water. So you take buffered octanol and you put buffered octanol, you add water, and you shake them together. Of course, the buffered octanol, the octanol and water cannot separate. Now you take your drug and you add it into that mixture where you have the buffered octanol separating with the water. You add your drug, you shake it thoroughly, and you allow it to stand, and you allow the drug to separate. You allow that drug to separate. Some of that drug will go to the octanol layer. Some of it will go to the water layer. The water layer is representing the aqueous layer within the body. The octanol is representing the lipid layers within the body. So when you get that drug and it separates after settling, then you take an aliquot, or you take some amount or some sample from the octanol layer, and you assay for the amount of the drug in that octanol layer. Then again, you take the same volume from the aqueous layer, you assay for the amount of drug in that layer. So we have amount in terms of concentration. The lipid water partition coefficient will be given by the concentration of the drug you get in the octanol layer divided by the concentration of the drug you get in the aqueous layer. So the lipid water partition coefficient is the concentration. You can get it in moles per liter, or in grams per liter, or in moles per liter, divided by of the drug in the lipid layer divided by the concentration in the aqueous layer. We are trying to mimic the position that you have in the body. So once you get the concentration in octanol buffered, you buffer it to pH 7.4. Again, you are trying to mimic the conditions you have in the body. Once you get the concentration in the lipid layer divided by the concentration in the aqueous layer, that gives you the lipid water partition coefficient. The higher the lipid water partition coefficient is, it means the higher of that drug in the lipid layer. So if you get a drug with a high lipid water partition coefficient, it means it will penetrate the lipid layers much, much more, but it might have very low concentrations in aqueous media because it is highly, highly lipid. The lower the lipid water partition coefficient, the higher the concentration of that drug in the aqueous layer. That means that drug has much more polarity, has much more polarity. Do remember, every time, even as you give a drug reasonable, appreciable lipid water solubility, lipid solubility, you cannot totally compromise. Just give me just one little minute, please. Sorry. Sorry. So we were looking and we were saying, once the drug has lower lipid water partition coefficient, it must be having groups that are increasing its polarity. So it will go into solution much more. Remember, we did mention for every drug, it must have some water solubility, because if it does not, then it will not be absorbed. Because for absorption, the drug must first go into solution and then form an equilibrium. And then the non-charged drug, or the non-polar drug, or the non-charged drug, is the one which penetrates the membrane. Once it penetrates the membrane, it pushes the equilibrium so that now more of the drug can go into solution. So always remember that the drug must always have some water solubility to allow it to go into solution within the GIT. Once it goes into solution, it will form an equilibrium. There will be the molecule with higher lipid solubility, the anionized molecule, and there will be the ionized molecule. The anionized molecule will pass through the membrane. Even the ionized molecule passes through the membranes by using carriers. And I believe you have mentioned methods of transportation across the lipid membranes. You can have carriers. You can also have active transport. So occasionally also that ionized molecule can also pass through the membranes if you have other supportive transport methods. So lipid water partition coefficient is a very important property of drugs, because it determines whether how well they will pass through the membranes, and even determines whether that drug will have CNS toxicity by being able to pass through the BBB. So one of the approaches is making these drugs have highly ionized group. A second approach is to create a very high lipid soluble compound. So we look at the first one, high lipid water partition coefficient. This has three effects. So when you create this drug to have very high lipid solubility, it will have high lipid water partition coefficient. That will have three effects: to have low water solubility, results in low concentrations in the blood, that's low concentration gradient, and therefore very little available, as I said. It has a very high lipid water partition coefficient. It will go into the blood slowly. So it has a very low gradient, because there is only low amount. And that low amount will just penetrate, go into the cells, and of course, there will be minimal to pass the BBB. Protein binding, which further decreases the concentration gradient by decreasing the amount of free and bound drug. Once the drug diffuses into the lipid bilayer, it sequesters itself in the lipid environment. This is what we are calling depotization. That when the drug has very high lipid water partition coefficient, there will be depotization within the lipid layers. And therefore, again, you'll be moving kidogo kidogo too, so you do not have enough to move. Because to move into the brain, it requires there to be an appropriate gradient in the concentration, between the concentration of that drug in the periphery and the concentration of that drug centrally. If the concentration already in the periphery is very small, then it will not be able to pass. This, a drug which has that kind of activity, or that kind of uses that kind of approach, is tafenadine. As we are going to look at its structure, it has very high lipid water partition coefficient, so it will not pass to the brain cells. You can also create a sweet ion that has low ability to pass through the BBBs, lipid barriers, and sweet ions. We have one we have already talked about cetirizine is a sweet ion, acrivastine is a sweet ion, and you see a number of drugs that are sweet ionic, and if they are sweet ionic, they also have polar groups. So when they are sweet ionic, they will also have polar groups, and therefore not able to pass through the membrane. You will find like a drug like fexofenadine, a carboxylic acid at physiological pH is highly ionized and has difficulty crossing the BBI. So when you look at a drug like tafenadine in the body is changed to fexofenadine. And the fexofenadine, as we are going to see the structure, it has a carboxylic group. Carboxylic groups at physiological pH, they are ionized, creating a highly polar group, and that polar group will protect that molecule from penetrating readily to penetrate extent, but it will not readily penetrate the BBB, and therefore will be restricted mainly within the periphery. So we are saying increasing the lipid solubility, adding polar groups, or making the drug sweet ionic. Making the drug sweet ionic will also be adding polar groups, and therefore retaining or restricting those drugs to remain in the periphery. And now, those are the three approaches. And after learning the approaches, now we can look at the examples. Again, the example will be among the examples. The classification is still retained with the classification we have done. We have the alkylamines, and with the alkylamines, this is the alkylamines, and with the alkylamines, you can see one of the examples is acrivastine. Look at this structure and tell me this drug is a derivative of which first generation drug. This drug, acrivastine, I've not even given you any small exercise. This drug, acrivastine, well, can you tell me it is a derivative of which drug, which is a first generation drug? Derivative of which drug, which is a first generation drug? That is acrivastine. Please give me the answer. It is a derivative of which drug, which is a first generation drug? That's the structure of acrivastine. Please let me get answers quickly. Answers quickly. That is our acrivastine. Can you see? Ooh, where are we going? This is our acrivastine. It's an alkylamine. In fact, yes, it's an alkylamine. It's an unsaturated alkylamine. Even giving you the hints. triploridine, yes, I expect, yeah, triploridine is correct. So if you look at that drug,